The 1969-70 Australia Tour of South Africa was the last series the then Springbok cricket team were to play before the country was plunged into sporting isolation. This is the story of how Ali Bacher's team, featuring Barry Richards, Eddie Barlow, Mike Proctor, Dennis Lindsay and Peter and Graham Pollock, beat the Australians in that series 4-0. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred and welcome to the show. On New Year's Eve 1969, Bill Lawry's Australian cricketers flew directly from, of all places, Bombay to Johannesburg. They had just completed a 10-week tour of Ceylon in India and might have expected a week or two of rest back home in Australia before the start of a 4-test series against a pumped South Africa. Their board had other ideas. They flew Lawry and his team south. The Australians had played 4 matches in Ceylon, only one of which was deemed first class, but 10 matches in India, with test matches in Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, Kanpur and Madras, where they played the 5th test. Going into the 5th test in Madras, Australia led the series 2-1, having won the first test at the Brabourne Stadium in Bombay and the 4th at Eden Gardens in Calcutta, while the Indians won the 3rd test by 7 wickets at the Feroz Shah Kotla in Delhi. In Madras, today's Chennai, Lawry won the toss and batted. Despite Doug Walters' 102, Australia were bowled out for 258, raising India's hopes of a series-levelling victory. Such optimism was short-lived. India could only manage 163 in reply. Before long, though, hope blossomed again. Despite sacrificing 95 runs on the first innings, India managed to reduce Australia to 24 for 6 in their second innings when wicketkeeper Brian Tabor was out-caught Eknath Solkar bowled Erapalli Prasanna for a duck. It had been a long tour for Lawry's men. Accommodation was not of the luxury 5-star variety, and breakfast, according to off-spinner Ashley Mallett, sometimes consisted of mashed banana on toast and a shot of whiskey. A walk in India in the late 1960s was no walk in the park. And now it had boiled down to this. After scrapping so hard on a hard and arduous tour, they only led by 119 in their final innings of the series, with their best batsman already back in the hut. The only recognised batsman left was Ian Redpath, the 5th man in. When Redpath was 9th out for a cussed 3-hour 63, with the total on 140, Australia were by no means out of trouble, but their lead was nudging 250. With the help of Lawry Main, Garth McKenzie, Alan Connolly and Mallett himself, they crawled to 153 all out. India had bowled 34 maidens in their 80.5 overs. Batting last, they would need to score 249 runs to square the series. The series had started with great expectation at the beginning of November. At all the test grounds, demands for seats exceeded supply. The Aussies had beaten the West Indies of Gary Sobers, Basil Butcher, Wes Hall and Charlie Griffith 3-1 in Australia the season before. Indian cricket fans reckoned their men might make a fist of things against the holders of the Ashes and what was very possibly the best test team in the world. India's reply in search of 249 in the 5th test began disastrously. They were quickly in trouble at 2 for 12. Their best batsman in the series had been Gundappa Viswanath, who had scored 137 on debut in the second innings of the 2nd test in Kanpur, and now he joined Ajit Wadekar. The two took stock. Watchfully, they prodded their way to India's 50. At the end of the 3rd day's play, India were 82 for 2, with Wadekar not out on 36 and Viswanath not out on 31. Resuming on the Sunday morning, the not-out batsman overnight brought up India's 100. With the total on 114, however, Wadekar was caught by Keith Stackpole of the fast bowler Main. Farouk Engineer was caught and bowled Mackenzie for 3, 5 runs later, and suddenly the procession had begun. Viswanath could do nothing to stop it. He was 6 out for 59 with a total on 142 as the Indians dive-bombed from their overnight 82 for 2 to 171 all out, losing the Madras Test by 77 runs and losing the series 3-1. The Australians were only too happy to leave India behind. The travel had been a grind. The food was alien. The conditions in which they were sometimes asked to doss down stunned them. Skipper Lawry had been accused while on tour of assaulting an Indian press photographer. The Indian crowds were often ill-behaved and unruly. There had been stone-throwing in Bangalore, a riot in Bombay, and a pitch invasion in Calcutta. At times, the Australians needed police protection because a splinter group of protesters were incensed by Australia's role in the Vietnam War. After their long march through India, they were exhausted when they arrived in South Africa, but if they could look past the constant reminders of apartheid, they were sure to breathe easier. That didn't happen. From the time Eddie Barlow scored his marathon 6-hour century in the first test at Newlands to the final test at St George's Park, the Australians were never allowed to settle. After South Africa posted a slow 382 on the broad back of Barlow's 127 at Newlands in the first test, Australia were in all kinds of trouble. 1 for 5 became 2 for 5, which became 3 for 38. 3 for 38 became 4 for 39, which stabilized slightly, almost establishing itself as something decent to creep to 5 for 58. Had it not been for Doug Walters' 73 and 19 down the order to Mallet, the Australians wouldn't have posted 164, a deficit on the first innings of 218. Thanks in the main to Aussie fast bowler Connolly, who took 5 for 47 in 26 overs, with 10 maidens, the South Africans never broke loose in their second dig. Graham Pollock got a square 50, and Mike Proctor grabbed 48. Both were Connolly's victims, as the Springboks, as they were then still called, cobbled together a slow 232 in 96 arduous overs. Combined with their first innings lead of 218, this meant Australia needed 451 runs to win, a huge task. Despite an opening stand of 75 and a second wicket stand of 55, no one in the Australian upper order scored quite enough. Wickets fell quicker than they should have, and slowly, like a cliff face falling into the sea, the Australian chase subsided. Peter Pollock bowled 18 overs for 19 runs with no wickets, and, in a neat little touch that seems fictional rather than factual, occasional bowler Barry Richards took the second last wicket to fall in bowling Johnny Gleeson for 10 with his dobblers. Chief destroyer for the South Africans was Proctor. The all-rounder legendary radio commentator of the day, Charles Fortune, referred to as Michael John, who took 4 for 47. This included trapping Lawry, with 83 the highest Australian scorer, leg before, as the home side won the Newlands Test by 170 runs. The Australian Cricket Tour of the Republic was played against a backdrop of the Stop the 70 Tour of Great Britain and Ireland by the rugby-playing Springboks. The Springboks arrived in Britain at roughly the same time as the Australians arrived in India. By the time the Indian tour was over and Lawry's cricketers were in South Africa, the rugby tour of Britain was nearing an end. On the 24th of January 1970, a Saturday and the third day of the test at Newlands, the Springboks played Wales in a dull 6-all draw at Cardiff Arms Park. The Wales draw was their last assignment on an acrimonious and certainty-shattering tour that the Springbok eighth man, Tommy Bedford, characterized thus, quote, "We spent all our time behind police cordons and barbed wire. Never mind that our bus was hijacked before the test against England at Twickenham. And then in Dublin, we were confronted by demonstrators lying in the streets to stop us getting to Lansdowne Road. The anti-apartheid protester Peter Hain, a South African studying mechanical engineering at Imperial College London, wrote letters to all the Australian cricketers. He hoped to open their eyes to the iniquities of apartheid and tried to persuade them not to visit South Africa. None of them obliged. They wanted to beat South Africa, who had beaten them 3-1 in a test series in South Africa in 1966-67, as much as the South Africans wanted to beat them. Hain was more successful organising the disruption of the Springbok rugby tour than he was the cricket tour, but the tides of world opinion were changing, and Hain knew it. Soon South Africa's cricketers would be left to play amongst themselves. Western Province versus Transvaal at Newlands, an all-white affair, while the rest of the cricketing world would play in World Cups and bilateral series. In 1970, South Africa's cricketers were no fools. They knew the end was nigh. Isolation would soon bite. The world was turning away from the bad smell in the south. What was happening in rugby with barbed wire and hijacked buses would happen to them. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't. They were scheduled to play away series against both England and Australia in the coming years, and it was moot as to whether they'd ever get to Lords or the SCG. They needed to make sure they wouldn't be forgotten. Their home series against Australia in 1969-70 was their last waltz. They were on the floor in their dancing shoes, pretty smartly. The first test was the curious outlier in relation to the rest of the series, a fact frequently occluded or simply glossed over in many accounts of the tour. The cricket was hard and almost excruciatingly watchful. South Africa batted well past lunch on the second day for their 382. They faced 167.1 overs from 5 Aussie bowlers, who between them bowled 54 maidens. None of them went for more than 2.5 runs per over. The 2.46 runs per over scored in the Australians' first innings was the most fluent scoring of the first test. It was hardly party, 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 disco, disco, disco. In retrospect, this seems understandable. The South Africans were concerned going to Newlands about the so-called Aussie mystery spinner, Johnny Gleeson, whose appearances Lawry kept to a minimum in the warm-up games. They were wary of Ian Chappell, who had dealt so well with the Indian spinners, but was also known to be a fearsome hooker and puller. They were also concerned about opening bowler Mackenzie. He, though, didn't take a wicket at Newlands and was only to take 1 all-tour, a situation that led many to believe he had contracted hepatitis while on tour in India. All of these things, combined with South Africa's 170-run victory, conspired to boost their confidence ahead of the second test at Kingsmead in Durban. Forgive me while I interrupt the sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com. As he had at Newlands, Bacher won the toss and chose to bat. Richards, on his home ground, was 94 not out at lunch and went to his 100 in the first over after the interval. In the hour after it, he and Graham Pollock put on 103 scintillating runs before Richards was out for 140, an innings many hoped would last forever. Pollock, meanwhile, continued to make merry. At close of play, he was not out on 160, the South African total on 386 for 5. Pollock added a further 114 runs on the second day to make 274. At that stage, the highest test score ever recorded by a South African batsman. South Africa declared on 622 for 9, and by close had Australia reeling on 48 for 4. By the end of the third day's play, Australia had been bowled out cheaply in their first innings. Bacher had enforced the follow-on and Australia were making a fist of it at 100 for 2 in their second. The next day was a Sunday, the day of rest, and although Australia was showing fight, the end was nigh. Or was it? After lunch on the Monday, the test entered the doldrums. From no quarter did wind blow or breeze stir. South Africa had lost the ability to take wickets, while Australia weren't scoring runs in sufficient quantities to give the impression she was winning the test. Barlow, never one for stalemates, sent his skipper, Bacher, a telegram. It said, quote, "Please, Doc, give me a bowl, bunter." Bacher assessed things. Barlow's figures at that stage were 0 for 50, but did Bacher have anything to lose? With a wry grin, he chucked Barlow the ball. Barlow promptly ripped through the Aussie lower middle order with 3 wickets in 11 balls. He accounted for Eric Freeman, Tabor and Mackenzie. When they were out, the test was effectively over. By the end of the innings, Barlow had taken 3 for 63 in 31 overs with 10 maidens. Barlow's contribution was not as elegant as Richards's. It was not as majestically powerful as Pollock's, but it was as bumptious as only Barlow knew how. The son of hard-working parents, who sometimes did a shift in the tuck shop at Pretoria Boys High, Barlow's old school, Barlow was the ultimate shapeshifter. He could grind out hundreds. He could take wickets with his cascading self-belief. In football terms, Barlow was the Springboks midfield dynamo. Bacher was the captain. One of his teammates, Lee Irvin, said that Bacher was a remarkable leader of men. Quote, "Ali brought us together for that series against Australia in 1969-70, and he did so masterfully. There were some tough buggers in our cricket at the time. Tiger Lance and Dennis Lindsay were hard-living party animals. Peter Pollock wasn't an easy customer, and Peter van der Merwe, the captain before Ali, had had his work cut out during the previous home series against the Australians. Ali took over from Peter van der Merwe, and he engendered this mind-boggling spirit. He brought us all together. His captaincy was incredible. But Barlow was galvanic. He galvanized the team. 5 of his 6 test centuries were scored against Australia, one of them a double. Others were brighter, better, more brilliant, but Bunter Barlow badgered the team forward by force of personality alone. In the 3rd test at the Wanderers, South Africa held only a 79-run first innings lead. Enter Barlow, with a slow-scoring second innings 110, reminiscent of his 100 at Newlands. With scores by Graham Pollock and Irvine, the Barlow 100 was the bedrock upon which the Springboks built their 408. Chasing 486 to win, the Aussies could only muster 178, South Africa winning the test by 307 runs to take an unbeatable 3-0 lead in the series. The South Africans duly won the 4th test at St George's Park by an even bigger margin. It was time to drink and to swagger. The Aussies were spent. They were homesick and exhausted. They dropped 14 catches in South Africa, a sign, so Lawry thought, of exhaustion. And a rift had opened in Lawry's team. A 5th test was suggested. Some of his men wanted none of it, the most vociferous of them being Ian Chappell. The situation was compounded by the South Africans offering to top up the 5th test match fee offered by the Aussie board. The gambit was considered and rejected, Chappell believing that if the Aussies caved in on playing a 5th test, they would have no leg to stand on in the future. As it was, they felt shoddily treated by their board, who didn't allow them to come home briefly after the tour to India. They went home without a 5th test being played, disgruntled, tired, and relieved. A strange and beautiful magic has attached itself to the tour. Everything that happened to the last Springboks seems perfect, so perfect that it appears preordained, as if some pure cosmic cricket logic were at work. Bacher won every toss and batted every time. Although scoring was sometimes slow, the batting hardly faltered, while the bowling blew like a whirlwind through the Australian ranks. Where to begin? Mike Proctor's 26 wickets, Graham Pollock's 517 runs at an average of 73.85, Richards's 508 runs. These were the only 4 tests he would ever play, while Proctor played in 7 all told at an average of 72.57. These are the statistics. What of the import of victory? How is it to be judged? In beating Australia 4-0, might the South Africans lay claim to being the best in the world? Hadn't the Australians just beaten India away? Hadn't they beaten the Windies at home the previous summer? Hadn't they just retained the Ashes? If they weren't top dogs, they were pretty close. Perhaps, though, the glow is nothing more than backward projection. We cast it because we know that isolation was around the corner, and perfection makes isolation and all that it means easier to bear. I don't necessarily agree. The series is luminescent in and of itself, yet we need to be careful. It might only be luminescent for some. Let's not forget that this was an all-white South African team from which too many cricket-playing South Africans were excluded. Seating at the stadiums was racially segregated, and many who sat in racially defined enclaves at the grounds shouted for the opposition. Mallet has written about being disgusted by the petty apartheid he encountered on tour. Here was a country at odds with itself. It was easy to see. The cricket was a panacea, and a way to protect oneself from what many rightfully sensed was impending trauma. The Soweto riots were only 6 short years away, and that truly was the beginning of the end. The past, they say, is another country. South Africa in 1970 really was another country, a pre-democratic country lost in the clenched fist and mighty bluster of high apartheid. It was so much another country that it was in another century, which makes the 1970 series against Australia look a little like a museum piece today. Trevor Goddard, Lindsay and Barlow are all dead. Bacher, Richards, both Pollocks and Proctor, to name the big 5, are still with us, but they're getting on and some of them aren't very well. When they die, the series will seem even further away. Maybe it will be upgraded to a darker, more obscure room in the museum, where the cards illustrating the exhibits are more difficult to read. Slowly, it will begin to seem as if the series never happened, although the fact that nothing, cricket-wise, happened after it for 21 years will act as a counterweight. In 1991, South Africa played 3 ODIs in India. Less than 6 months after that, the national side played in her first World Cup in Australasia. It's been a remarkable 30-plus years, but consider this. In a way, isolation beckons once again. South Africa is a second-rate test power. We don't have the financial muscle to be taken seriously, and our board has been so beset by trauma, bloodletting and upheaval in recent years that we aren't taken seriously there either. This isolation is all the more galling because we've isolated ourselves. We've failed for years to get a T20 tournament up and running and have now finally done so with the SA20 at the 3rd try. We've failed to check the rise of shockers like Tabang Moreau, the once chief executive of Cricket South Africa, and for the most part, we've treated our players poorly. Last week, we achieved the rare feat of a 2-day test match at Newlands because Cricket South Africa and the Western Province Cricket Association couldn't between them prepare the pitch for the second test against India correctly. A couple of days later, ICC match referee Chris Broad deemed the pitch, quote, unsatisfactory in his pitch report. Next month, a team with a 37-year-old uncapped leg spinner and a 23-year-old uncapped captain will do duty for South Africa in New Zealand, while the SA20 hoopla, with South Africa's best players in it, barrels towards a conclusion. Why did this happen? It seems it was allowed to happen because the administrators double-booked and couldn't read their diaries correctly. New Zealand, although further away from the world centres of cricket power and worst off in terms of time zones from the lucrative Indian market, have not isolated themselves. they have remained competitive. In 2019, they lost the World Cup final on a technicality. Their player stocks are smaller than ours, and so is their economy. Yet South Africa have shot themselves in the foot. Now we hobble when we should romp. It's a strange and sobering state of affairs, now isn't it? If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.